My name is Yannick, and if this is your first time at PHP Sussex, we are a Brighton-based user group dedicated to PHP and to web development in general. We gather once a month, usually on the second Wednesday of the month. In a minute, I will be joined by tonight's speaker. His name is Derek Rettens, and I'm sure many of you will know him as the author of Xdebug, like the massively popular debugging and profiling tool for PHP. But on top of that, Derek is also an independent consultant as well as a PHP core developer. And tonight, Derek is going to tell us about some recent and upcoming features of PHP, which is basically like getting the information from the source. And so, yeah, I'm very much excited about that. But before we do that, Alex is going to tell us a few words about Silicon Brighton, who support this meetup, as well as many others in the area.
Check. Oh, sorry. Brand new. Can you tell? I'm walking around like, everyone look at my camera. Don't you love it? So my name's Alexandra. I work for Silicon Brighton. I'm the community builder at Silicon Brighton. Have any of you been to a Silicon Brighton event before? I can see. Yeah. Oh, amazing. Cool. Welcome back. Sorry, I don't really know what I say in these things. I'm just saying I work with Silicon Brighton. It's great. Really happy to see so many of you here. What we do and all of the stuff that you can see here, the AV, and it's all supported by a group of members that we have. So cue next slide. Fab. So this is all of the members who support Silicon Brighton so far, and we love them, and we're really, really grateful to them. And the next slide is, so as well as this meetup group, we also have another 22 other meetup groups that we've got loads for the rest of July, and then we're having a bit of a break for August, and then we're back in September full on. But we've got a special event for Pride. We've booked a walking group, so if anyone would like to walk in the parade for Pride, you can do that with us. We want to support the mission as much as possible. So yeah, if you want to register here, or you can go to our website, siliconbrighton.com/events to get on board with that page. Should be a really lovely morning. And we're just going to hang out, walk in the parade, and then in the afternoon have a couple of drinks at Barclays Eagle Lab, because they're having a special party there also, which is right on the walkway. So yeah, and also check out our website to have a look at all the other meetup groups that we support, and we've also got our events calendar on there. So fabulous. I think I said everything. This is Steve here. This is our founder. Sorry, just in case. I didn't know what else to say. Have I forgotten anything? No? Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much.
I don't know what's wrong with that.
Okay,
There you go. I'm back. Yes.
Technology.
Oh,
That's me.
Thank you, Alex. Derek, come here, mate. How are you doing? You all right?
I'm good, yes.
So first of all, thank you for being here and for doing this. We really appreciate it. And then before we get started with your talk, actually, I would like to talk about Xdebug, actually.
Yeah, which I'm not talking about tonight.
Exactly. Right. This is not to talk about Xdebug, but for a lot of developers, it's a staple when it comes to PHP development. So yeah, I thought while you're here, it would be a shame not to at least mention it, right?
Right.
I guess the first thing I would like to know is like, I guess to provide some history, like when did you start working on Xdebug, and what was like the context at the time? Like, why did you start doing that?
When it's just over 20 years ago.
Right.
So it's quite some time ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I have I call this a birthday in my calendar that reminds me every May when another year ticks over. And yeah, it's nearly 21 years now, so it's a long time. I started working on that mostly because when I started programming, that's a bit longer ago. There's Turbo Pascal. Anybody have heard of that, maybe? And that always had a debugger built in, and I've always grown up writing computer code with debuggers everywhere. And I started doing PHP. I mean, PHP is written in C, and C, I did some of it. C has a debugger called GDB. PHP didn't have anything, and I even 20 years ago, I found it quite annoying that you have to do echo and var dump, and don't forget the pre-tags around it all the time.
Yeah.
And started thinking, well, maybe I can write a GDB for PHP. So the first version of it was pretty rubbish. It had the same kind of interface as GDB. If any of you have ever touched C debugging with GDB, you need to type the commands on the command line, and it's pretty terrible. It's still pretty terrible. It hasn't changed much in the last 20 years either. But from there on, I mean, I started working with a guy that wrote an IDE, Weaver Slave. None of you have ever heard of this, I'm sure. And then started talking to a lot of people that had actual IDEs. Komodo, some of you might have heard of that. And with them, I then developed like the step debugging.
Right.
But Xdebug has been doing many other things since then as well. I mean, there's a profiler in it, there's a function tracer in it. It powers PHP units code coverage most of the time,
which I use. Yeah.
So there's all these things as well as step debugger. But yeah, it's been a long time, and still new things to add because PHP gets new features. I'll talk about that later. And other people come with good ideas sometimes, and IDEs improve, and so it continues.
Yeah. No, it's pretty amazing because I started working with PHP 15 years ago, and Xdebug was already very well established then. It was already part of the toolbox. Do you know roughly how many people use it today?
No,
you don't. Like it's not really quantifiable, right?
I have no idea. I know I can see how many people downloaded it, but that's from the packled.php.net website,
right?
Which is only a handful anyway, because it comes in distributions. People download the Docker, compile for source code, so I don't actually know how many people use it.
Yeah.
If I have to guess, tens of thousands?
Probably even more, right?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine.
I
don't know. I mean, I only know about people using Xdebug if they complain about it, right?
Right, okay. And is it mostly you working on it, or do you get some external contributions as well?
There's some very small external contributions. It used to be quite a bit more, back in the early 2000s, because the people that the people from Active State that had Komodo, they contributed quite a bit on the protocol as well, and some things there. But nowadays, it's pretty much me,
right? Okay.
With very small or additional people doing things here and there.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So I kind of assume that must be quite a lot of work then, because you've got your activity as a consultant and your role as a PHP code developer as well.
Yeah.
So that must be a lot of work, right?
Yeah. I mean, just to think of, I mean, even keeping Xdebug up to date with PHP would roughly take me about a day. To support it properly takes about a day a week.
Right.
For almost every. I mean, maybe not every week, but mostly that.
Yeah.
Because there's bug reports, there's new things in PHP, there's new versions, new operating systems. Sometimes that happens too. Keeping that up to date takes quite some time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Actually, I'm kind of leading with my questions because I know you've recently published a blog post about
which one?
Sponsorship for Xdebug.
It isn't. I mean, this is not just an Xdebug thing, right? It's an open source thing. It is really, really hard to get companies that get value out of open source to contribute to it. And usually, I mean, open source, the whole idea is that people contribute to it. But for some things, like Xdebug, like PHP as well, and a whole lots of other things that in the PHP ecosystem, it's sometimes just too tricky for people to do. And if as a company you can't necessarily help out that way, you're basically using things for free, which is no problem with that, right? I mean, it's open source. You're supposed to do that.
Yes.
But there are then also very large companies that make a whole lot of money out of using open source, including PHP and including Xdebug. It'd be nice if that kind of groups would then also financially contribute so that these bits of code can be maintained, right?
Yeah.
And we see that luckily now with PHP, there's now the PHP Foundation since about a year and a half. That's how I end up working on PHP and getting paid for it. I've been working on PHP for, even longer than Xdebug, so 21, 22 years or something, on and off. I mean, not always as active as I'm now, of course, but it is good to see that the larger companies, the WordPresses, the Automatics, I should say, the Magentos, that, maybe not so much anymore now, but contribute to the support, contribute financially so that the open source can be pushed forwards and has a nice future as well. Because at some point, I mean, if I'm the only one working on Xdebug, right? At some point, I'm going to want to retire. I mean, that's not
That
quite
would be
now yet,
well
but
deserved,
that is
yeah,
going
for
to happen
sure.
at some point. I wish it could be now, but
Yeah.
and I mean, what happens then, right? And especially with things like PHP, or because there's so many people that know the insides of PHP well enough. I mean, I would say that there's 2 people that will know the JIT engine fairly well. Or Opcache, for example, there's maybe 3 or 4 people that understand it, and that's not enough. I mean, it's not sustainable. I mean, some people disappear randomly. Life gets. I'm not quite saying in a way, but life happens, right?
Yeah.
They have all the priorities suddenly, and then you have like one person knowing things, and that is really, really hard. So that's one of the goals of the PHP Foundation as well, is get more people in to train them to work so that they know to work on the PHP language. And some of the work I'm going to work on is also coming with more documentation and more knowledge sharing so that other people can actually contribute to PHP.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So I started giving tutorials on that at conferences, but the intention is that gets turned into like a tutorial/learning session. I'm not quite sure what the full format of that is going to be in the near future. So I think it's important. So that's, yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for giving some, behind the scenes for Xdebug and your work and the open source in general. But yeah, I'm gonna let you get on with your talk now. So yeah, please welcome Derek for his talk. What's new in PHP 8.1, 2, and 3?
I need that.
Yes, you do.
And I need to switch tabs.
Yes.
Yep. If this still works. So this clicker has an up button that I think goes to the next slide, but it doesn't. I need to press the down button. And that was very confusing the first time I was using that. Well, it's easy to fix, right? I can hold it upside down. Yeah. All right, I can't read my screen from here, so I'm going to have to look back and forwards. Apologies for that. So hi, I'm Derek. I've been introduced. I live in London. I'm European. We can discuss that over more beers later, maybe. I used to be the PHP 7.4 release manager. That is a fancy word for herding cats, making sure that people get their stuff in on time and that releases get made. Release managers don't get decisions on what goes into PHP. They only have to do all the tedious, boring work of making packages and wrangling with Git most of the time. I work part-time for the PHP Foundation. I work part-time on Xdebug. I like maps, beer, and whiskey. That's irrelevant, but it has nice icons, so make the slide look nicer. I am sort of on Twitter, but I don't really use it so much anymore. So the next time, every time I give this talk, I change the color to make it slightly less readable. But yeah, you can still find me there or on Mastodon if you have further questions. The PHP c.social instance on Mastodon is actually hosted by the PHP community itself, so they're all very friendly people. So if you want to try Mastodon and you're a PHP developer, that's the way to try it. Also, I get to approve you. All right, so let's dive into the journey of PHP in the last 2.5, 3 years. So originally, I wanted to give a talk about just PHP 8.3. That's not really useful because I'll be done in 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. So what I actually wanted to do is I want to turn it into a bit of slightly of a journey about PHP has been doing in the last 2.5 to 3 years or so, to tie them all a bit together, because you probably find out that there's sort of a journey in here, what is actually happening. So before PHP 8.0, if you ever wanted a class where you needed to accept like integers and floating point numbers as numbers, for example, quite a common thing to do, right? How would you do that? How can you tell PHP that these numbers need to be integers and floats or floats? I mean, you can't, right? What do? You use doc blocks. And your IDs and your PHP stands and so on will tell you when you do things wrong, but this is not great. So we started adding things to PHP type-wise. So we get our union types. A union type being your property can be either that or that. If you have an argument to a function, you can either accept an integer or a floating point number. But if you inherit it, then your inherited function can accept a wider range of things. because that still means that your original class and your new class can still be used in the same context. So that kind of rules is called variance, and I always mess up covariance and contravariance, and so I will not be using those terms because I will get them wrong. So I like to call it making things more wide, accepting more things, or making things more narrow. So arguments you can always make wider in inherited methods. Return types you can only make more narrow. In any case, we have our union types. Union types are just the beginning. All right, so why did we actually get union types? Now, that is actually not because we wanted you to use union types, it's because PHP internally already had union types for a long, long time. With embarrassing APIs such as microtime, depending on which argument you pass in, you get a floating point number back or a string. These are terrible APIs. I mean, methods should never return a different type depending on an argument that you give it, right? It's just really hard to reason about what you get back. But PHP had this. Often they were either string or floaters like microtime, or it was in the case of it was something or false. So base 64 decode, you get either a string back or you get false back in case it couldn't decode it, for example. So PHP has had this for a long time. And the introduction of union types, the intention was that it makes it easier for PHP JIT engine that converts PHP code down to bytecode that you can run on your CPU to make that kind of inference easier. That never happened. It doesn't make anything better there, but it did mean we had union types in PHP now. Right. So union types have rules. You can't have void as part of a type because something can't be something or nothing, because that makes no sense whatsoever. You can use question mark, which is equivalent to using or null. We also get false as an addition to the types, but we didn't get true because PHP didn't need it. You also can't duplicate types, so you can't have bool or false because that's double up, right? If it's a bool, it can also already be false, and PHP will tell you off if you do these things. Similarly, you can't type int, or I should not use the word type int anymore. You can't type things object or whiskey because object is an object, and that's double up. So these union types follow these variant rules that PHP's always had. You can always, as I said, widen arguments and narrow return types. And we had some interesting ones in here, like array or traverse was the same as iterable because PHP used that so often internally that makes sense to have. So these are our union types. Now we get in more typey in PHP, right? So in PHP 8.1, we introduced read-only properties. So what you can do is, well, how would you do read-only properties normally? I mean, what you can do is you can set up a private property, and then you need to have a setter, or a getter in this case. If you have a getter, you can't have a setter. If you don't have a setter, then outside of the class, of course, you can't set the property. So that's how people did read-only types. Now, PHP 8.1, I can't always remember, but it's PHP 8.1 or H2, so that's why it's on the slide. We got actually a read-only keyword, and read-only is a bit of a weird name because it basically means a write once. A read-only property is useless if you can never set a value in it, right? Because then why have the property? Why bother with it? So the restrictions on these read-only properties are you can write them only once, and you can only do that from the private scope. So you can do it from your constructor when you do something, or from methods called from your constructor when this is happening. You can't do it from outside the class at all. That's great. Of course, when you have read-only properties and your class has 24 properties, then sometimes you just want to make the whole class read-only, which is what PHP 8.2 introduced. So you can now have the read-only keyword on the whole class. But what this does is it makes all the properties that you have defined read-only by default, but it also does one other thing. It also means you can't have dynamic properties anymore. Dynamic property being a property that you haven't declared, which is still assigned to. Because dynamic properties have no type information, right? And then if you would allow for that, then you could still write to a property that isn't then read-only anymore, because you can do it multiple times because it had never had this read-only keyword attached to it. So if you use a read-only keyword for your class, dynamic properties are also no longer allowed. Talking about dynamic properties, I forgot to have a slide about that. They have sort of been deprecated in PHP 8.2 anyway, with the intention of removing them in PHP 9, with some caveats, which I'll get back to or not, whether I have time. Yes, also, you can't use a read-only keyword for a class if you don't have typed properties, because the read-only keyword only works on typed properties. The way how the internals work is, you can't do it. It doesn't work because there's not enough information to check things in that case. All right, in PHP 8.3, that's not out yet, by the way. PHP 8.3 is going to hopefully come out at the end of the year. I actually don't know what the suggested date is. It's usually the last week of November or the first week in December. Maybe, whether it's ready or not. If it's not ready, it's going to come out later. It's usually fine. I don't think in the last 5 years we've ever deviated from that date by more than a week. And that was only because somebody's gotten date time maths wrong. And that happens. Now, what do the read-only amendments do? It was proposed to actually do two things. First one was that if you inherit from a read-only class, the inherited class did not have to have the read-only keyword attached to it. It didn't have to be a read-only inherited object. That didn't pass, so you still can't do that. The part that did pass was the following. It's like, if you do clone, then within your clone handler, you can rewrite read-only properties, again, only once, which is really useful, right? I mean, terrible example here, but if you have a log entry with a title and the current date, if you instantiate it like this. By the way, writing PHP Sussex, I've struggled with because it usually came out as PHP and then I write SUXX, and that's just really rude. So hopefully I've not actually left that any on the slides. But the thing is, what I'm pointing at is if you have clone in it, then in your clone handler, you can then rewrite these properties, but only once, because that's how that works. What you can also do is that from your clone method, you can call another method that sets the properties, but you can only do that while the clone keyword is active, sort of is. So PHP's internal check that in that case. So that's new. That's in for sure because it worked when I checked this earlier today. Oh yeah, that was pointless. Now, you might have seen the syntax that you might not have seen before. We call this constructor property promotion. Like if you originally had a class, my class is called Whiskey. I use an emoji in front because that makes it really hard to type for the people. And you can actually use that in PHP. I wouldn't recommend you do that. So if you have like this many properties, right? I have 4 in this case. If you want to write it out full, what do you get? You have the name of each property 4 times. You have the types 2 times. You have lots of assignments. This is all boilerplate code, right? It's really boring to type. So that's why we got in PHP, should have put it on the slide, 8.1 I'm going to say, but it could be 8.2 or 8.0. When you put the visibility keywords in front of your arguments in your constructor, it automatically gets defined as a property, as a type property, with a type string, distillery, or bottler, or null. And it also does the assignments for you automatically too. Now, in your constructor, mine is empty in this case, you can still do the things you want to do in your constructor as well, including overriding these values again. If you want to do that, that seems kind of pointless, but you can. So there's basically just boilerplate syntax to do things much faster. But there's a lot of few useful things about this as well. For example, here, if we have this object, so this is something for my Whiskey note-taking app. This is where my hobbies come into play. And part of that, I have like a search form or search and order form. And sometimes in the results, do I want the distillery information in here? Do I want the description in here? And if you construct such an object, then sometimes you get code like this. So I do new settings, true, false. Now, if you read just this line, what do true and false mean? You don't know, because the code doesn't tell you, right? You have to go look at what the constructors are. Or similarly, if you want to change just the sort by fields, you have to specify every other field first, and you need to know what the default values are. That's really annoying in this specific case. So what we got in PHP now is named arguments. And named arguments, basically what they allow you to do is you can do the name of the argument and then what you want it to change. So it doesn't touch any of the other default values. It also makes your code a lot more easier to read, right? Because you know instantly what this new settings object is going to do. Is like it's not going to include the distilleries. Or similarly, if you want to change only the sort fields, then you can just get to just specify that without having to know the default values of anything else. Now, named arguments, they are a bit of something that people argue about, whether you should use them or not. Because the moment you get named arguments, that also means that the argument names in your methods are now part of your public API. Now, some library authors never thought about this, so they have rubbish names. As an example, I will pick the PHP language. If you look internally, for example, at the datetime class before we introduced this, it wasn't even consistent. Like sometimes it's called timestamp, sometimes it's called datetime, sometimes it's called date. All of these things meant the same thing, right? So we had to go over every single function in PHP, and there's like 3,500 of them, to make sure that inside each extension, the names are at least consistent. That's a lot of work. And if you've ever have a public library, then a maintainer of such a public library can choose to say in a documentation that I want to have those named arguments as part of the public API. But many of them will say, no, we don't care. So if you want to use named arguments, fine, but we reserve the right to then change our names, and that then will end up breaking your code. So you need to be really careful with when you use these things. If you would ever interface with a composer installed library that hasn't specifically said that we support these named arguments, you probably shouldn't be using that because you don't know what's going to happen. If it's your own code and you know what your own guides and rules are, then of course feel free to use it. I think it is mostly useful in the case where you have this style of classes and objects, where you have like just a bunch of values that you want to set one by one, like I have in my settings thing to do searching. So nice feature, but be careful when you use it. Now we got enumerations. Enumerations are a way of basically setting, we have a object, and this object, no, let's say type, and this type can only be one of several versions. Not versions, values is what I meant. So let's take the currency enumeration. And the enumeration here I call currency, and it has two possible values, GBP, and EUR, pounds and euros. This is what the basic syntax looks like. Now, enumerations are classes, but they're special classes that have been instantiated by PHP as static objects. You don't need to know that, but that's how it works internally. And enumerations, I mean, if you've ever seen them in other languages, that's what it does. If you have a product class, you get to type in against currency. And then when you use it, you use currency, double colon, and then you use one of the values. But this whole thing already exists as a static object. You can't do anything with it, but it exists already. You don't have to instantiate or anything like that. If you then do a var dump of it, you get something back like this, and it will just tell you that it's an enumeration value, and not the string EUR, for example. That's important, because if you would pass in EUR as a string, anybody wants to guess what you get back now? An error. So you get a type error because you're passing in a string and not a currency thing, a currency value. So you get an error. That's good. Some people were arguing that enumeration values should automatically cast to a string if they are backed. Which brings me to the next thing, back to enumerations. So it's actually possible to attach values to these enumerations. You can either use that colon string or colon int. You can't do any other values, only integers and strings. Because I don't think it makes more sense to have any other types in there. Floating point numbers are always a bit wonky because everybody knows that 0.1 plus 0.3 isn't 0.4, right? Like at 0.3999994 or something. So you can only do string and int. And the syntax for that is like this. You do then equals pounds and equals eurocent. But what does not happen is there's no toString method defined on these enumerations. You can't simply cast them to a string. And that is on purpose. Because the whole idea behind enumerations is that it is type safety, that something can only be these two values. And if you would automatically cast it to a string in like an API, then you can still pretty much pass in any other string in there as well. And that is something you don't want to do. So that's why PHP doesn't support that. And we actively denied a change proposal to add that functionality. In any case, if you do var dump, you get it back. Also, if you use xdebug for step debugging, you will also get the value back. The IDs actually support it and show you something fancy that is an enumeration value. So the back values, you can access these values by using the value property. Okay, that's not very interesting. Similarly, you can create an enumeration value by using the from method, static method on the enumeration. You don't have to define that. If you try to define the from method yourself, you'll get an error because you can't do that. And so you pass in it a back value, and then if that exists, you get back the enumeration value that belongs to it. Now, sometimes if you have to do this from user input, so maybe some American passes in a $, then you'll get a type error because it doesn't exist. However, if you have to do with user input, you can use try from, and that basically can pass in any value. And if it doesn't exist as a back value, you get null back instead of a type error, which is kind of useful. All right, so enumerations, they are classes, right? And on classes, you can define methods, and enumerations is no different here. So here I've defined the format method on the enumeration, and that uses a new match keyword. I say new, that's PHP 8, I'm going to say 8.1. And a match keyword works like switch, but it returns the result of the matched case. I'll try to explain that. So what match returns something, and what it returns is like, well, it first compares this to the value. So if currency GBP or currency EUR. And then if that matches, and this can be an expression, doesn't have to be value, it returns the result of this expression over there. So if the amount that if match is currency GBP, then pattern will be this value percent dot to F, and if not, it returns the other one. If it matches to something that that match doesn't have a clause for, you get a type error as well. So do that, right? If you pass on something that isn't one of your switch clauses and you have no defaults, you would never know what's going to happen because just nothing happens. Match will give you an error if you do that. You can get around that by using default. Yeah, question. So that's the other one. It doesn't fall through. Yeah. So unlike switch, you don't have to use break. You can't actually, because you can only use one statement on the right-hand side and one on the left-hand side. So no, there's no way of breaking or falling through. So that's another benefits of using match, in my opinion. And then, yeah, we'll return the format with the value that we pass in. And then you can call the methods and you get numbers out of it. But similarly, you can also have static methods. So if you want to construct an enumeration value from something else that you pass in, again, you can use match. You give it locale. You have Dutch, you have Italian, you have Ukrainian, Great Britain. I typoed that the first time I made this presentation 3 years ago, but I thought it seems fitting to leave it in now. And yeah, and it works in the same way. So you can use this as a factory method to create an enumeration value out of this. Again, I probably should have used a default clause here because it's quite possible that people pass in German as a locale and then you get an error and you prefer not having errors in your code. So there should probably have been a default in there to return, I don't know what currency you want to do. Again, that's how you run it. A few more things with enumerations. You can list all the cases and you get back the enumeration values, not the backed values. You can then loop over them and do things with it, whatever you want to do. You can also do properties. Oh, no, actually, you can't. You get errors. So some people wanted to have a global constant where you have like a currency value on the left-hand side and then matching that with a number. You can't do that. So somebody made a request for comments, an RFC as we call that, to actually allow property values to be read on syntax like this on the left-hand side of an expressions. We looked at that and we said, no, we can't really do this because there's so many edge cases. But what we do allow now in PHP 8.2 is the following. You can actually access the value property, but you can only do this on enumerations and only the value property, because there's actually a use case for this, and we couldn't come up with a use case for any other situation where you want to do something like this. And nobody has complained about it since then, so I guess we made the right choice there. I have never used this. I probably never will either, but some people write interesting code. Oh yeah, we got some other fun types. We got the never return type. And the never return type basically says this function must not return ever. So it should never get to the end of the function, which you get by sending exit, you're running die. Is this useful? I don't know. It also works implicitly if it gets called some else other way. I don't know. I don't think I find this very useful. The people that wrote static analysis, the people behind PHP Stan and Psalm, they thought this was really useful. So that's why we have this. I've not used this before. Yeah, you can only use it as a return type, not as an argument, because using never as an argument type, I don't know what that's even supposed to mean, right? All right, intersection types. So I've showed you the first slide had union types on this. An argument can be something or something else. But what if it has to be something that does both things? For example, the argument that is going to be passed needs to implement two interfaces, which is actually a situation that you see in PHP quite a bit, right? If it has to be traversable countable, meaning that you can pass it into for each. How would you do that in PHP? Shall I read through this code and then you all quiver in horror how interesting this code? Interesting is not the right word. So what it basically does here is like we create two properties. One is called traversable with a traversable or null type, and then we have private both, and we document that this variable needs to be traversable and countable at the same time. We pass it in. We set traversable as a reference to both, and we do the same for countable, which means that the moment you now assign something to this both, because both references operate on the same value, it will actually check in turn whether it implements both interfaces. And if it doesn't, you get an error about that. Please don't do this. Instead, upgrade PHP and use this instead. So besides the union types, we now have these intersection types to define that an argument needs to implement both interfaces. It can also be either a class or an interface, but you can't do this with scalar types like integer or string, because something can't be both an integer and a string at the same time. But it works for interfaces and classes and abstract classes and maybe even traits, but I've never tried that. I think this is kind of useful, mostly for traversable and countable. Or where you also see this sometimes for when you do tests. No, actually, I can't think of another example here now. Yes, I mentioned that, so I have to say that. Some other fun things in PHP, like silly things. PHP 7.4 had like this ... operator in here, right? So you can stick in all your apples into this fruit salad, and then it's basically implicit insert every element into the array at this point. And then you get a fruit salad. Please don't put tomatoes in fruit salads. But in PHP 8.1, we also get, because we have these named arguments, we now also have support for these things in for key types, because it's quite a common practice to pass things to a function as this variadic arrays. But if you have named arguments, there was no way of doing that without still requiring the order, because arrays without the keys have no explicit order. So that's why we sort of got this feature. But what you now also can do because of this is that you can basically construct arrays out of ... apples. It says put all the apples in here, and then follow that up with all the others. And then if the keys match, they will override versions that already exist. Makes no sense with, I mean, this is a silly example, but where it does is actually kind of useful is that if you have a class that has settings in it, and you have a set of default values, you can now very easily conflate those together by using your default values in your first one, and then you override it with things that are passed into your argument, and then override the keys that then have values in that array. And then if they aren't in there, you can still keep the default values from the other one, as an example. Right. we have first-class callable types. So the way how you sometimes how PHP originally would do references to function names is by returning something like this. You have an array, you have an object, comma, and then a method name. Some of you must have used that in the past. But that has some issues, actually. Like, if you do this with a private method here, you call this code, you do new test, and then you do test get private method. You get this array back from this and private method. But when then you call this, it can't work, right? Because we have no this. And even if we added this, you can't call private methods outside of the scope. So that doesn't work in this case. So PHP for a long, long time had this feature called closure from callable. You give it that name, and in the moment this closure from callable is being called, it will then bind the this to the this in the scope that where this call is being run. So the moment when you then call the method, this still links to the original object, meaning that you have this, even though that doesn't exist in this scope, but also you can then access this private method because the scope has been put into this closure. Now, the problem with this is that this is really annoying to type. So where we got extra, in PHP 8.1, is this ... operator again. And if you do that as the only things inside a argument to a function, it basically does the same thing as a from callable, but a lot easier to type. And it is basically syntactic sugar. Closure from callable strlang is the same as doing strlang ... This method is the same as this. So it's just a much nicer way of writing this. And it works for basically every other variant that you can think of. There's so many that I didn't even fit on the slide. This is kind of useful, and I have used this. There was actually an intention to extend this so that you could actually have values in there as well, and then what you get back from it is like a partially applied method already. But that was really complicated to do, and there was lots of arguments about this, so this is why we don't have this yet. But it is possible that we will see this coming back in a future PHP version, but not PHP 8.3, because feature freeze has now happened, or soon enough. You don't have enough time to argue about JRC anymore, pretty much. Oh yeah, PHP 8.2, we finally added some other types. So we already had the null and false types, but you could not put these part of a union. So you couldn't do string or false, or you could do string or false, but you couldn't do string or null and false, and null or bool. These things were not possible because you had to use the question mark. You could also not use null standalone, even though that is sometimes useful to have. So in this example here, I have like a user finder, my normal class. And I do find user by email, and I pass an email, and then you get a user back if it finds it or no. But if you have in some test instance or something, you have an always null finder, which extends that. And from that, you always wanted to return null. You couldn't specify that because you couldn't use null as a return type. So you had to leave it out. And because you leave it out, it's not type safe anymore. So yeah, we now added this type in PHP 8.2. We can now type just null. Great, isn't it? Also, we had false, but we never had true, because, as you might remember, PHP never had something or true internally, so we didn't find a need to add it. But then that makes incomplete language, so now we have true again as a standalone type too. However, it is important to know that the types true or false are different from the other scalar types. So if you are a non-strict type and you pass in something to a Boolean argument, then PHP would type juggle that to a Boolean value. But if you use true or false, it doesn't do that. And if it doesn't match the exact type, you'll get a type error. Whereas with Boolean in strict mode, it would always cast. With true or false or null, it does not cast at all. So you'll get a type error. All right, so you remember the union types, int or float. You remember the intersection types, traversable or countable. And then what if you want to do things more complicated? You want something to be x and a, or y and b. So you couldn't specify that at all, because you could either have an intersection or a union, but you couldn't have both in the same time. So PHP 8.2 introduces DNF types, disjunctive normal forms. There's a reason why we like calling this DNF, because disjunctive normal forms, if you say that a lot, you'll struggle with your words. And that basically allows for you to do a union of intersections. You can't do an intersection of unions. But that is also not necessary, because you can always rewrite those as a union of intersections. If you don't want to take my word for that, read the RFC, because there's a nice worked out example on it. But yeah, we think this is enough. And this is actually, I mentioned before that reversible uncountable was used for each, but that would still not have allowed for just arrays. So you can now do array or traversable uncountable. And this is a intersection, but there's an intersection of one type, which is still an intersection. Of course, it doesn't add any further restrictions. So yeah, you can pass an array or traversable uncountable if you want to do that. DNF types, I don't think we will go further than this, because we don't really see the need for doing that. We got a new random extension for all your random funkiness. It knows how to do things correctly without you having to think about seeding randomizers and stuff like that. And how do I get the fruit salad in the right order? And it's actually just a really much simpler API for getting random stuff out of PHP. So if you want to get 8 random bytes, you call get bytes on the randomizer, and you get 8 bytes back. Now, it is a little bit more complicated to use, because there's multiple randomizer engines. The one that PHP already had is called a Mersenne twister. Again, look up what it, if you want, because I don't remember anymore. But it isn't particularly very good for certain use cases. Neither of these are cryptographically strong, by the way. But there are better engines such as I can't even pronounce it. Xoshiro 256 star. More stars is better, apparently. But of course, we can't have the star in a class name, so you have to write out the whole word. And you can also get to seed these, and they are defined in such a way that there's an actual standard for it, unlike the Mersenne twister that PHP had, where other languages had a different way of doing it, so you could never share the random seeds with them, because they would be doing different things. Getting an integer, you can go get int 1 to 100, and then you get a random integer back. The same thing, get next int, that just gives you an integer. But it would do the same thing if you'd call it at the same time in the same way with a seed value. If you don't provide a seed value, then of course you get different random numbers all the time. That's why I have commented it out, because if I reload my slides, you see that the numbers actually changed, because this all runs live in PHP. But if you seed it, it's seeded in the same example, so you would always get the same values. So that's why I haven't done it yet. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of fun things in here. The random extension, if you have any random use case, please use this and not your homegrown stuff, because it's just better at what it does. All right, I was mentioning that the read-only keywords, that we had dynamic properties, and you can't have those in read-only classes. So from PHP 8.2, we actually deprecated this. This is one of the RFCs I voted against. I regret that now. It doesn't matter. It passed anyway. Because I had code like this. Can you see the mistakes in this code? Somebody didn't know how to write the word palette. And when I ran my test suite, sorry. When I ran my test suite with PHP 8.2, I got an error message saying you typoed something. This error, to be specific, the creation of the dynamic property palette is deprecated. And then I went over this and fixed that. This is more important if you have type properties. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yes. Excellent. Thank you. I know, after a while, I now need an extra hand too. No, it's fine here, I think. Yeah. Let's not tip this over into the electrical sockets. We'll be fine. Cheers. All right, so I'm getting to the end, so nearly there. Also in PHP 8.2, we got sensitive parameters. Sometimes if you have code like this, right, you have login, username, and then password. Now, if you create a stack trace for some reason, and you send a stack trace to lots of people to figure out why you couldn't log in, it has your password in it, right? And that's not great. So PHP 8.2 introduces this sensitive parameter attribute that you can attach to arguments. And if you do that, and you get a stack trace or a log message, then it will no longer show up as its value, but you get only back object-sensitive parameter value. Now, if this is in code, like if you do get debug backtrace in PHP, you can still access the value by using the value property, but by default, it will not show up in your log messages, which is really useful to not automatically leak passwords. We've also gone and looked at all the APIs that we had in PHP itself, and anywhere where there's either a key or a passphrase or a certificate or a password, we attached internally this sensitive parameter keyword so that I also don't show up in log files anymore. I think it's kind of useful. So if you have xdebug loaded and xdebug creates a log file, it doesn't actually return this object kind of thing, but it just says as a string sensitive parameter, because if I didn't do that, I'd have to construct an object, convert it to a string, and then get rid of the object, which seemed pointless. So it just shows you the string value sensitive parameter. xdebug doesn't have a way internally for code to get to this value anyway, so there was no reason for me to do that. Now, that does mean if you use step debugging, you can still see the value, of course, because it's a debugger. But it doesn't show up in log messages, which is what we wanted to do. All right, talk about attributes. So all the things I'm showing you now are accepted for PHP 8.2, but are not necessarily final yet. So things might change, possibly. So for example, we have a new attribute called override. And override is a keyword that you can attach to methods. And if you call this method and it isn't overridden, there's no base class or interface or trait where it is defined, you'll get a type error. So what's wrong in this slide? Say this is a PHP unit test. There's a whole bunch of things in the setup. I open a log file, and in the teardown, I close this file and then unlink the file. What have I done wrong here? Yes, exactly. I've misspelled it. Teardown, which means that this method by PHP unit would never be called, right? Because I just typoed it. So though I've overridden it, it doesn't do anything because I misspelled it. So in PHP 8.3, you get to tag that with override. And if you tag that with override and a method isn't overridden, you get an error. And of course, that then makes it really obvious that you typo this and then you can fix your typos. I think this is actually kind of useful. It took me a while to understand where this is. And the way behind this is this works not only with methods, it works with anything where you would expect it to work with abstract classes, with traits, with interfaces. But that's just too much stuff to put on the slide. But it is a way for you as a developer to signify that this method must have been overridden for anything else. That also means that if your class that you're inheriting from removes that method due to refactoring, you also get an error message because it's no longer overridden, which is also a nice hint for you that you need to fix more things. So yeah, you might have noticed that over the last few years, the last 3 or 4 years, PHP has gotten a lot better for you to be more expressive of what code needs to look like it has named arguments, much more typing, helps for you to figure out what your intent is. And I think that's a trend that we'll see continuously over more upcoming years as well. Override in PHP 8.3. Now we also get type class constants. And I was testing this out early today, and this is not code that, this is kind of fun, right? I mean, I have an interface where I have a test constant. Then if I implement that, it's suddenly a different type. So which type is this now finally after you have extended the class? It is now suddenly null, and neither a string or an array, which isn't great. So in PHP 8.3, we've introduced type class constants so that you get errors when you do this wrong. Unfortunately, there's a bug that I found out this morning where it doesn't actually give you this error yet, but it should have told you that when you do this implementation, well, this is no longer a string, so it gives you a type error, right? But yeah, PHP didn't do that yet. From what I saw in emails flying past, there is no pull request, so this might actually be fixed now, but it wasn't this morning yet. New things is going to work, didn't work yet, which also then gives me the hint saying that, well, once PHP gets to beta releases, maybe you should try them out on your own code. First of all, to figure out whether your code works with PHP, newer version of PHP, also to help us find bugs, because we can write as many tests as we want. Artificial tests for a language do not compare to real-life applications, because people in the real world do all kinds of weird stuff that you can't always think of. So please, if PHP comes out with a beta release, the first beta, I think that is still some time away, please go test it on your code and see whether your code breaks or PHP breaks. Both of them are good to know, I suppose. Right, and then the last thing that I don't think is particularly very useful, but it is something to make PHP more complete, like we made it more complete by adding the true type, for example, or the null type in places where you couldn't use it. It's one of these things, like you have variables, right? So you have properties. You can have, if $bar is the name of a property, you get that property back. You can static properties by using $, and then in between curly brackets, $, the name of the static variable. You can do it for methods, for static methods, for classes with static methods, but you couldn't do it for class constants, which seems a bit arbitrary. So you can guess what's on my next slide now, I guess. Is that PHP 8.3 will now introduce its syntax for class constants as well. So you can now do curly brace opening, name of your class constant, and then you get it just works. Interestingly, we also made this work for the class constant itself. Sorry, for the class. So class is a constant that works on every class, but it is fake. Like, it's something that PHP does is to replace it with the name of the class, the fully qualified name of the class. And now you can also do that dynamically. So if you set, I mean, this is, of course, pretty pointless, setting the variable name in class to class and then using class, because you could just as well have used class there immediately. But in some cases, that might be useful to have. And then, yeah, you get a fully qualified class name out of this. That's just there for completion. Whether this is useful, probably not. But having the dynamic class constants here can be useful if you want to iterate over all of them. But then again, if you want to do that, probably should have used an enumeration. All right, that's all I had to talk about. There's a few other things in PHP 8.3 that are currently being voted for. Some of them are probably going to get added to PHP, others are not, but I didn't want to jinx it. And there's still a few more days to vote on those last things to do, so that's why I haven't introduced them yet. If I give this talk at some point in the future, these things will also be in the stock, and I will probably have removed some others. Having said that, are there any questions? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, Mike. I was going to repeat the question, but sure. I've done this a few hundred times before.
Hello, is it working? There we go.
It works. Hi.
I was just curious about where the inspiration for the new features comes from. I know, lots of other languages like have some of these features. Some do, some don't. But I guess what drives the inspiration? Is it popular languages say, "Oh, this other language has this; it's very popular. Let's bring it in," or is it just an internal group that thinks, "Yeah, we like this"? And
yes, bit of both. Some things we see in other languages as being useful, like the intersection types, for example. Although there's a use case for those in PHP, that is pretty much stolen. It is more for making the language more complete. Whereas other things, like the sensitive parameter thing or the override, they come from users of the language that see a use case for having features in it. Like the one with the sensitive parameters came from a guy that works for a company where they have a software suite where administrators of the suite help other people out on a forum. And the amount of times he said that passwords were being leaked to like cloud servers and stuff like that was so high that this was a really useful feature for them to have. So there's a bit of that. Some of the features come out of frameworks. Like Symfony wanted to add some things to the language, so they got introduced if, the community agrees to that. So it comes from all kinds of inspiration. And sometimes it's just a person think, oh, this is a really, really good thing to have. Let's see whether I can convince enough people to either to have this feature and also to help me implement this. So yeah.
And then just for my memory, is it the people that vote for that? There's a community of set people that vote on the RFCs that come in, basically.
Yeah, the people that vote for it are the people that have commit rights. That's not very well defined, and that's sort of on purpose-ish.
But that's sort of like the big contributors, like Symfony has a number of core people, don't they?
Symfony has, I think, 2, which is, I think, Fabienne, but that's Fabienne and Nicolas Greckers, I think, have voting rights. I don't think Fabienne ever uses it. But the voting isn't necessarily the most important thing. It is much more important that you actually contribute while the discussions are going on, because from good discussions about features, we still vote on things, but the things that are just really well thought out, they will pass nearly unanimously. So we don't really need to vote for it. So I know some people who are angling for getting votes because, oh, I've been contributing so much to this language or this framework, but we're not very keen on just doing that, because in order to vote for features, you sort of need to be part of the discussions, and it shouldn't be just as an afterthought, like, oh, I like this feature, because it goes a lot more into it than just liking a feature. Like, sometimes a feature looks really good, but it's really hard to implement, or can't be implemented in a very performant way. So then, even though you might like it, you'd vote in that case for it, but that means that we have a really shitty implementation of it, for example, or things like that. So there's a bit of that, but yeah.
Thank you. So I do have another question.
Yeah, go for
I'm
it.
going to hug the mic.
I'm here all night.
I know this specifically about features of 8.3, but performance is another thing, which I guess is something that's constantly improved. Is 8.3 bringing large performance improvements as well? Do we know?
From what I know, 8.3 does not bring large performance improvements. However, it also doesn't make things worse. Okay. Of course, if you make your types more complicated, that will take more time. If you add an attribute, that will take more time, because PHP does need to check for it. But there's no big I think it is really hard at the moment, actually, to find like really easy things to make faster, because we have done so much of that. So I'm not sure whether there's very much to cut, so to say. Especially when you have opcache, and if you use the JIT engine, well, the JIT in PHP isn't particularly very useful depending on your use case. But it is really hard to find things to make things go faster. And when we look at things, it turned out that then sometimes comes with stuff that is going to break, because breaking because something that PHP currently does maybe is not a fully 100% optimal, but if it's used in a while, we can't just break people's code either, right? For a fraction performance improvement. Makes no sense for us to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Well, I've got one.
Yeah, go for it.
How would you approach upgrading a code base to a newer PHP version? Do you have any advice for that?
Well, first of all, test all the betas so that you have a heads up. That gives you 4 months extra time. But it is often also the case that open source libraries that your application might be using needs to get upgraded first as well, right? So it's not possible to, the moment PHP 8.3 comes out, that you can rely on other libraries also be on PHP 8.3. It will just take some time. Tests. You need to have tests. You need to test early, often. And for every version, we produce an upgrade guide saying which things are going to break, possible break where you need to look at. And there is a tool called Rector, which is really good looking at these things automatically and tells you, or even automatically upgrades your code forward to make it work with newer PHP version, but still keeping it working with older ones as well. To be honest, I don't think PHP 8.3 is going to have a big impact at all, because I don't think we have made changes that I think will impact lots of code bases. To be fair, we're actually getting quite a lot better about checking already open source code to see whether changes we make to the language end up breaking code that already exists. It sometimes happens, like because we have now the override keyword, you can't have a global class called override anymore. But when we looked at the top 2,000 projects on GitHub that use PHP, there are maybe 2 that did it. And that seemed to have been code that was throwaway code anyway, so that doesn't particularly matter in that case. So yeah, test. Make sure you have tests to begin with, and you can always work on that. Run it, and run it against the PHP versions that are coming out once the alphas and betas are hitting. That's what I would recommend, because it gives you a heads up. And also tells you that which dependencies need changes as well, because you might sometimes run into that too.
Yeah, thank you. And good shout about Recto as well. It's
I like Recto. I've only recently been using it, and it already saved me so much annoying little changes that needs making sometimes. It's like
it's an amazing tool.
Tedious work, yeah.
Yeah. Any questions? Still nobody. I do have another one. There's one here.
Yeah, go for it. Microphone.
If it's okay to ask about Xdebug, then I have 2 questions.
Yeah, sure.
If not,
go for
then
it.
I've only got 1. The first one would be, will PHP ever get something like template strings in JavaScript? Being able to, reference, say, inside an array, for example, with the curly braces is really useful, but being able to put like an expression in there would be super, super useful.
I'm not sure. I actually sort of think you can already do some of that.
Really?
Yeah. If you have a double quoted string and you put a dollar curly brace in it, you can use expressions in there.
Can you?
I think so. I've never used it. I hear people talk about it.
Okay.
And there might be some small things that you can do that with. So maybe? Yes? No? I don't know what the answer is in that case.
That's worth me.
Something to try out with. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I've tried it and it doesn't seem to work. But
I think one of the issues with that could be is that it would then mean recreating the whole syntax to also work into double quoted strings.
Yeah.
And that might just be too much overhead in the language itself. So that'd be a reason why this wouldn't happen.
Cool. My second question on Xdebug. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole at one point, and I think you mentioned on a talk on YouTube somewhere that you were looking into implementing time travel debugging.
Yeah.
Is that still something that you plan on adding? And if so, how's it going? When will it
I shall explain what that means first, time travel debugging. The idea is that currently if you do step debugging, you can only step forwards, right? But you cannot step back. PHP already has this tracer function that dumps basically every function call and variable assignment and return value to a file. So the idea behind time travel debugging is that it dumps a file, binary likely, that then can be played back through the debugger. And because it has all the states embedded in this file, you can also step back. So that's the idea behind time travel debugging, which is something I do want to do, but it's going to be a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It also creates very big files in the prototype that I've tried doing this in. So yes, it's something I want to do. What will not happen when you're replaying it back is it will not actually execute code. So it won't make API calls again, or it won't write things to database or files, but you can inspect the different states. So yeah, that's something I still want to do. But as I said, it's a lot of work. That is literally months and months of work. But I would like to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There's a question online.
Yeah.
Someone is asking, do you still use DD or like var dump, I guess?
Yes,
You
but
do?
very, very few. No, that's not a word. Not very often. I mean, PHP has this built in for a long time, right? And for some simple cases, yeah, I'll throw an echo or DD. Well, not DD, but var dump and things like that. But my setup is now for all my PHP projects is that I run it in the IDE in PHP Storm. I have the debugger always available. So why would I? I mean, I can just click and then reload the page. I don't have to type anything. It's much faster for me that way. So no, I almost never use it because my setup is such a way that the debugger is just always runs. Because there's not a lot of overhead, so why wouldn't I?
That makes sense. I think that was slightly tongue-in-cheek, to be honest.
That's fine. I had guessed.
Any other questions? Yes, over there.
Right. If you can get out of your beanbag.
Yeah, the read-only properties.
Yeah.
I've been working on a 8.2 code base recently, and PHP Storm was using a constructor property promotion. It's saying you can use read-only, and it's available, and I don't need to change the type or the instance because it's like dependency injection. Is there any benefit to actually setting it read-only if you don't need it to be? Because I've only been doing it just because PHP Storm's been complaining that, hey, this is a feature you're not using. Is there any benefit to do it if you don't need it?
If you don't need it, no. Well, it just means that you can't reassign things to this property anymore. But I mean, I think this is a stylistic question, which is tricky for me to answer, right? Like adding the read-only keyword, I mean, because you're using an extra feature, will make things run slightly slower. Probably not something enough for you to measure, be able to measure. But yeah, this is a stylistic choice. If this is something that you want to see in your code base, it makes it easy to reason about if you never change these things. But yeah, other than that, I'm not sure what the benefit is.
Thank you.
I mean, it does stop you from then using this on older versions of PHP because it doesn't have the keyword. So that's another thing to weigh in, of course. How many versions do you need to support?
Anybody else? Maybe one more? Yeah.
That's all right.
You mentioned PHP 9.
Oh yeah.
Is that something that's already been worked on? Is there already sort of plans for that, or is it just at some point?
PHP 9 is for us the time when we can remove the things that have been deprecated. So in that way, it does exist as a concept, but it has no time frame. Basically, if we deprecate something in PHP 8, we can't remove it until 9. So that's why as a term it exists, and that's why you see some RFCs already mentioning PHP 9, but I can't tell you whether it's going to be next year or the year after or in 2037. Okay. Probably before 2037.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
If I'm going to have to guess, we're going to get at least PHP 8.4. But why would we call something 9? I mean, we've had some discussions about maybe make a major release every 5 years so that we also have a set schedule of when we can remove deprecated features, because removing deprecated stuff just speed up PHP. It also makes our code base easier because we don't have to think about these things that have been deprecated anymore. But that's still an ongoing discussion, so I don't really know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to stop here. Thank you very much. That was super insightful.
One more slide.
Yes, I'm going to get on to... Sorry, go for it then.
If you want to see the slides afterwards, you can scan this QR or go to the URL. If you have questions, you can email me. I will let you scan this, then I walk over and switch it to your slides.
Amazing. Please let's get a round of applause for Derek.
Cheers. Do you want your slides back?
Sorry?
You want your slides back?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, I do have a few more things to tell you. Just going to do a little dance in the meantime.
Please don't.
Too late.
Sorry. Oh. I don't know what I did there. I pressed Ctrl F5 to make it go big, but then it didn't go full screen.
That was, don't know.
And I might have added extra slide for you.
Yes, that's the one. So yeah, some upcoming events in the Silicon Brighton network. So you can scan the QR code over there for more information and to register as well. I've never been to any of those meetups, so I can't tell you much about them. Yeah, just assume the first one is like a Microsoft-focused cloud computing meetup. I don't really know the other ones, but yeah. Do look them up. What else? Yeah, we do have the next PHP Sussex meetup planned. It's for September. I was skipping August because I'm going on holiday. And but do join the march in August with Silicon Brighton for the Pride. Definitely. So yeah, you can scan the QR code now and register now. The person is quite a good, amazing speaker as well. It's that person is someone who did one of the keynotes for the PHP UK conference earlier this year. So yeah, you can try and guess if you want. And I think that's it. No, there is the Slack. Yes. So we have a PHP Sussex channel on the Slack run by Silicon Brighton. So you are welcome to join both. We just basically try to keep the conversation going in between the events. So yeah, please do that. And I think that's pretty much it. Just as always, we're always looking for speakers. So if you've got like an idea of a talk, you're not too sure, do get in touch like with me or Silicon Brighton. We can definitely arrange something. It doesn't have to be a long one. I'm thinking of maybe doing some lightning talks at some point. So maybe between 5 and 15 minutes. So, you know, if you want to try some public speaking, but on a smaller format to start with, we can arrange that as well. So then again, get in touch. But yeah, I think that's it. So thank you all for coming. You are welcome to stay for a bit longer, I think, for like maybe another drink and a chat. If not, yeah, thank you for coming and take care, and hopefully see you next time.